Welcome to this week's draw process. I'm Ike. I'm going to draw a comic book page and process about being a comic book artist and what I'm doing on the page as I draw it. We have the thumbnails. We were just outside of the fortress. Now we're seeing inside it. There's going to be word balloons that guide you to Denise, the leader of the soldiers, that woman, and a soldier next to her. She's talking to him. There's a boat right there. There's like a pool that comes in to the fortress from the canal. And the boat is actually like parked in there. And they're discussing preparations for Sun to be transported to the Emperor. And then she makes her way into the double doors to King Croc's den, his throne room, that we've already seen earlier on just one page. I think it was maybe 13 or something. So that is the thumbnail, and that is the page that I am going to draw. And the thumbnail gives me a pretty good idea of where things are going to be at in physical space. I'm going to have to use my phone throughout the drawing. You might see it pop up at times. I'm looking at the thumbnail because I don't have anywhere in front of me that it's just sitting up. But sometimes I pull up a reference picture. Most of the time I need to reference something from a prior page that I've already drawn, so I might not be exactly sure how someone's outfit looks, and I can just pull up how I drew it last time and put it in place. But sometimes it's a detail that I want to get, like this boat. I referenced Greek and Macedonian boats and got an idea of how this one could look. This boat is, for all I know, I'm going to have to draw it quite a few times later. So I couldn't just make it up on the page totally because I haven't written the next issue yet, and I don't know how much that boat's going to be involved for the rest of, the upcoming story. Okay, I, loosely putting in place where my horizon line, my vanishing point will be to get these angles right. I'm trying to position things in an even ratio to where it's easy for me to redraw later at different angles. So the height of these pillars is the same as the wall, and they're at the same angle as the tower, and they're on a quarter, they're kind of at a halfway point between different objects in this space, so that keeping it so symmetrical like that, it's going to be easy to draw this from different angles later when I need to. This was not super well designed. You saw the thumbnail, it was pretty rough. And what I did on that thumbnail, I made it up on the thumbnail. I may have drawn a few versions and erased and just kind of drew it on top until I got what I wanted. Same thing with the exterior. So like on the prior page, I drew the exterior of it, and now I have an idea of what the interior needs to be shaped like based on the exterior design. So there's a certain amount of making this up on the page that I embrace. I think on this page I stuck with the same pencil, which is kind of heavy and darker. You'll notice that I tend to hold my pencil rather sideways and loosely for these early lines that I don't want to make heavy. Very shape-based drawing, this one. Not all of my backgrounds are so symmetrical and blocky, but this one is so easy to just simplify into these blocks and position them out. And I had an idea of where the light source is going to be. Besides these, there's these flames, these fires going on top of each pillar, but there's also, from the last page we've established where the sunlight is, and it's getting lower. So I knew where the shadows were going to go, but I haven't scribbled those in just yet until I get my basic position of things down. But the shadows are going to be falling to the left and down because the light's up and to the right. So I know that going into it. I'm not worried exactly how much of an angle to put that shadow at. I'm going to choose it based on what looks good. Once I get this laid out, I'm going to play with where to lay that shadow line where it actually looks good. Instead of telling myself, well, it's this time of day, it's got to be this length of shadow, and I'm stuck with that. I would rather it look good and let it not be exactly right. The shadows are just like the lines, outlines of things. They serve the composition and need to be read and not create tangents. Little bitty figures here on the page. I've been keeping up with the sketchbooks pretty well. I'm overdue. This week's been kind of crazy. I'm a little overdue on some of the sketchbook work I like to do. Haven't drawn a comic page this week. Today is a Thursday for me, and that is weird, but I know I'm going to do it on Saturday, and I've got a few done ahead of time, so it's fine to get it in time for the Sunday's post. But I still need to color and letter a few pages, so got that to do. But yeah, falling behind a bit, had other life and work things that I needed to do that kind of took the forefront. But I've been keeping up enough with the sketching, and got a few new comic books to just look at other great art. So Essex County and Scott Pilgrim. I think I've seen some Scott Pilgrim, but I thought I'm just going to pick up the whole volume 1 when I was at a bookstore, a local one the other day. It is just so expressive and straightforward in its storytelling. I find that attractive. And I've always heard good things about Essex County, so I wanted to check that out. And a few other books I'm reading about mythology and kind of like Jungian archetypes and the feminine throughout folklore and masculinity in it as well. And just expanding my horizons of understanding of humans and storytelling, stories. Just different ideas on how to write things that really resonate with people. So I don't think there's a magic formula that I'm going to find that I use, but I always like to learn more perspective, increase my perspective on these things. So earlier we drew the interior of this, of King Croc's throne room, and that's what this main building is. So the amount of blocks and the position of them is predetermined by the interior space. So I'm trying to figure out, okay, if it looks like it did on the inside, what would it look like out here? So that's why I'm struggling with this too, is it's like it needs to match what was on the inside. And so I was realizing, okay, inside it's 4 blocks high, but on the outside you're going to have that extra layer for the roof. And then how would I construct that in a realistic way? If this is all just giant blocks and that's kind of how I did the interior, then how would that be possible that they're not just caving in? So there's a little bit of physics you have to consider. It doesn't hurt to have architectural or construction knowledge in these situations, but in my case, these blocks being triangles and leaning on each other in such way, with this beam in the middle and these other kind of like from the inside you can see these supports in place. Like it works enough, it's believable enough. And I'm not super concerned with that, but it's kind of like this, like no one's probably going to look at that and go, oh, that's not quite like what it looked like from the inside. Or that looks like it would cave in. Like people don't usually think of those things. But if you think of those things, at least in my experience, then you'll put a little more detail into the environment that people will pick up on and appreciate. Like, they won't know the reason I put extra detail or made it the shapes that I did. They won't know that I had some like architectural reason, but it will have me at least considering and thinking about it and trying to add some details. The placing of shadows. So I like to do really heavy blacks. I don't do any cross hatching and stuff. So I'm going to use color to indicate things that are in shadow, and then heavy blacks for the things that are the most direct shadow. So when the camera is this far back, when your view's this far back, like, and you know, I've got the shadow on the ground, let's say, from these objects. That is your primary shadow. That is the shadow created from the brightest light source, the sun, coming down. Now, technically, the face of these pillars on the grounds of the fortress, the face of them, on at least on one side here, well, I guess both sides that are kind of showing the front and the left side of them would be in shadow too. They're not in direct sunlight, but they are receiving secondary light. And that it's just something that I think becomes difficult for people that just use like heavy blacks for shadows the way I do. It's like, okay, well, what do I make my everything that's in shadow just black? Because if I were to do that on this page, you wouldn't be able to see the elements I want you to see. Like, the pillars would just be like solid black. It actually wouldn't look as good. So what I've found that helps me make more sense of it is the primary light source's shadow that would probably be the brightest and have the most clear edge. I often put that shadow as solid black. But then things that are lit by secondary light sources that aren't, they don't have that edge where the bright light hits them, they don't need to be solid black. I can do that through color. There's an interesting thing that happens too, where when light hits an object, like in that case, the light source is on the right, and so the shadow's falling to the left. But then in the part of the object that is lit by secondary light, the shadow should not be to the left. Typically, the shadow is going to be to the right. This is not precisely accurate, but I'm just saying to simplify this for the drawing we're doing. And that it's counterintuitive to think that the shadows would be going towards the light source, but it makes sense because it's lit by a secondary light source, not that one that created the shadows that were going the other way. So I hope that makes sense. It's hard to just say these things without like demonstrating. But if that if you're ready to learn that, if that's something like, if that clicks for you, then that's, you're the person who was probably ready to hear it. So if that didn't make sense, you can ignore that. And if it did, and it kind of made a light bulb go off, then good for you. That's, I don't have to clarify it further than that. Here I was struggling with the background behind them. So I understood that behind this camera's like up, and like it's kind of 3/4 up looking down. We're going to be seeing the ground behind them, but it's like, well, how much ground are you going to see? What exactly is this angle on these figures? And so I was trying to figure out where in physical space they're located. How much of the wall or pillar would you see? And I tried a few options, but I also didn't want to create an ugly looking image, a composition. If this pillar went right behind her body in line with her, then that's going to look like not attractive and confusing. So Can I play around with where this where the planes are, where the camera is, to get the pillar in a spot that it looks okay, and knowing that word balloons are going to be filling up most of that space anyways. I think what I opted for was that the pillar is not visible at all. It's falling off it's outside the view of our camera. It's probably to the left. And then I chose not to distinguish at all where the wall ends and the ground begins, because it's not really in focus anyways. It's so far from the camera. And the word balloons are going to cover it, and I didn't want that line to form a tangent or just be too in focus, since I only use one line weight. It would have just been unnecessary. So that's why we've ended up with this kind of scribbly plane behind them to give me a sense of that, but with no details added in. So with my phone up here, I am referencing her costume. I just tend to forget, how these things are shaped. This is kind of a downward angle on her, but it's not extreme. So, just a slight adjustment to the form for things to be getting kind of smaller as they get down towards her feet. It's always helpful to pay attention to symmetry of the human form, to think of the midline of your figure, which will curve along their body, but maintain that perpendicular, to the ground line. And keeping that in mind really helps things not get funky when you start to do these angles like this. You'll also see I drew off of the edge of the paper, of the panel anyways, because I wanted to make sure that the form of this soldier in the foreground is good, is like that his body size and position makes sense. So it just helps me to see the other half of his body. I definitely think in terms of form and not so much line, and then I simplify it down to just like a line. But that's why my pencils get so like scribbly and have a different quality to them than my inks do, because I'm finding the forms. So if I went straight to line without finding the forms, well, then it loses some realism. It loses its grounding in three-dimensional space. It's very difficult to go straight to a line, an outline of things, without thinking form. It definitely comes in handy with drawing architecture, to think in terms of three-dimensional form and not just like the outline of it, because those things are three-dimensional, and your mistakes will show because they're using they're very boxy typically. But this it applies to your figures too. So when I started building this drawing here, you'll notice I struggled with where to put my vanishing point. I thought it would look good to keep that kind of lower vanishing point to make the doors look more imposing, but I messed up, because as Denise is walking towards the doors, I want them to look, I don't want her to like cover them up. I don't want her to look bigger and more imposing than the doors. I want the doors to kind of seem imposing that she's walking into. So I keep fiddling with it, raising that vanishing point up the panel further and further up until I got to like what I should have known from the start, which was, if that horizon line is even with these soldiers' heads on either side of the door, and she's about their height, then that's how tall her head's going to be. Like, in my mind, her head was going to fall below the door, but it's not. Like, if that horizon line's hitting the door where her head, like below where her head would be if she stood by the door, then she's going to be taller than the door. So I had to keep raising that vanishing point. It would have helped to draw her in the foreground first for reference, and then I would have known where my vanishing point needs to go. But I guess I did it out of order. I did the doors first, and then tried to make her fit, which made me have to, do this, erase the perspective lines I'd put in place and raise the vanishing point more and more. So that was a struggle for no reason. And it led to another struggle that I'll point out in a minute. So, yeah. And it matters because the doors and the wall that it's on is three-dimensional, and it needs to, go to the same vanishing point. So you'll notice I have these scribbly loose figures in place before I start fleshing them out more to make sure that they work in three-dimensional space. It's giving me that blurry image in my mind, to build off of. But here you'll notice, this is the other mistake I was mentioning, I don't really have a gestural sketch of how she will look as she's walking. I just thought I could build it from imagination. And maybe I could have, but I didn't pull it off. I didn't execute it to my liking. It is not typical for me to draw people walking on a flat plane. Like where you're just seeing them from the back or the front, and they're walking dead toward the camera or away, like straight up the Z-axis. That angle of walking looks so flat that it doesn't look like they're walking. So and with her being on this, with the vanishing point being so high, the horizon, she is on a plane that is quite in perspective. Like there's going to be, her front leg's going to look quite a bit shorter than the back leg. So I've got to get that perspective correct. And I've got to make it look like she's walking, even though she's, just on this Z-axis. So it is a kind of challenging pose, especially for me, people who draw mostly in comics with camera positions that are more typical for this sort of visual storytelling. So if I kept struggling with it, I was considering looking up a reference. Like after a few struggles, I'm thinking I could just look up a reference, and that way I get a better idea of the female form at this angle. I'll get it. I ended up pulling it off to my liking, just fine. But again, I've got the same problem again. Not the best gesture drawing underneath, and I'm just trying to immediately draw. And it doesn't help that. Well, you can't see that when I erase. It's hard to see on the camera here, but I can still see some of the drawing underneath that I'm building on top of. So it's not like I'm going completely to start over when I erase. I still can see some of what was there, even though it's hard for you to see on the camera here. And of course, the added challenge of this cape and how to make it flow probably distracted me from getting the figure right. But I knew that I wanted her cape to have movement to it and make it move like left and right, since her body is so flat on the Z-axis. But I also wanted the cape to swing out of the way so you can see her legs and hips and stuff. So if the cape was just, I could have saved, time in a way by just letting the cape cover her up, but I didn't want to I thought it would be a boring panel because first of all, she's covering up the doors quite a bit. And then if I have her cape covering her up, a panel that's just people's backs, I try not to have panels that are simply, that are only functional. Like that I need my character to get from A to B, so I have to put this panel here. I would rather more be communicated in a panel, and show more. So that was why the cape was off to the side. These guys, these soldiers are supposed to be pretty tough. So I wasn't sure, but I wanted them to be a little large, a little muscular looking, because they're going to be fighting later. But nothing extreme. So now, yeah, they're basically supposed to look the same size, and they don't quite. So I kind of have to look at it and see, okay, do their feet line up? Do their hips line up? Does their head line up? And it doesn't quite. So when I go to ink here, you'll see that I actually mess it up. Like once I draw it with ink, I realize, oh, these don't line up. I need to lengthen these legs, use a little whiteout to fix this. It's not a huge deal, but that happened. And the inks. Fast lines, no ruler, trying to embrace the imperfections, the wobbliness of lines. It's especially hard when you do like this line I just did. Left to right in one long swipe is difficult. I don't like to rotate my paper when I draw. I just want to leave it flat. So I have to get better at moving left to right across the page without it getting wobbly. I don't typically have really long straight lines in my panels either. So that is a less common problem, challenge that I have in a panel. But yes, kind of looser lines, not too particular, and that's partly because the shapes I have laid out are so solid that the wobbliness of the line work does not detract from what feels solid. Yeah, but if it was laid out too loosely, and then drawn loosely, it wouldn't feel very solid. So I guess I think of precision in other steps than in the actual line itself. Yes. This boat. So originally this boat was going to have a sail, a main sail, but that would have been a distraction substantially. It would have that would have risen up in front of the middle of the panel. It would have maybe blocked the view of the King Croc's den and stuff. So it doesn't really need to be there. Okay. Yeah, I've got these rough scribbles of where the shadows are going to be, and I've got to make those final choices. Of where to put the shadows. So this is a situation where basically the sunlight is behind them. So didn't want to throw them entirely in shadow, so we have other light sources that are creating these shadows for them. So yeah, kind of like it's tough because I want her to look imposing and special as she's walking towards these doors. This whole page is you're seeing her in her element before she's faced with conflict in her role. So we're going to see her feeling confident, powerful. At the same time, she's intimidated by King Croc. So it's like sometimes the messages get lost if it's too mixed. It's like if I wanted, I want her to be to seem large and powerful, but obviously King Croc way more so. And you can do that visually, like literally make him way larger. And then it's the same problem with the design of his den. I wanted his den to be to feel like a damp cave, like that's kind of enclosed and just where a pool, a cesspool or something, right? So I didn't want it to feel like this huge, imposing, tall, visually space. But at the same time, I wanted to capture that he is large and imposing, and this is a big, imposing space. So those kind of conflict with each other. Is like, I want it to feel like you're walking down into his den, but I also want it to feel large. So the ceiling, I went with a high ceiling, and I went with really large blocks on the walls to make everything feel so heavy. It's kind of difficult to capture both at once. So same thing here. She's looking powerful walking in these doors, but the doors are represent this like transition to a space in which she's is nervous and less powerful. So here, the soldiers on either side and the wall and doors are all lit by secondary light, because the light source, the main source, the sun, it's behind this building. She's standing in the light and she's walking into the shadow. And this is kind of another example of how to handle the shadows. That where that hard edge is in front of her, I've got that is a hard line with totally black shadows. But even though these soldiers are standing in that shadow, they still have light on them, secondary light. If I just put them solidly in black, maybe with just little accents to show that they're there, it might look darker, but it would also be harder to tell what you're looking at, more tedious to draw, and less accurate in a way. And there with the door, I put a shadow on the left side of the door, even though her shadows, does that make sense? It's on the left side of the door, but the shadow is like, it's as if the light source is on the left, creating shadows on the right. But where she's standing, the light is on the right with the shadow on the left. It is like just such a fundamental principle to grasp, especially when you want to do heavy blacks. This whiteout is just very minor touches, like where lines overlapped a bit or something. There's the finished page. So that was it. Nice solid shot. of the interior space. I could not. I wish I could have shown more of the space, but I couldn't get the camera any. If I got it any higher, you would lose the depth of the height of things. It would be almost bird's eye top down. But if I got it lower, then the front wall of the fortress would block your view. So that gets it. It's not real life. It's not like a real fortress with real cameras that I have to position. But at the same time, like, it is. I need to consider it somewhat real, that I can't put the camera inside, like, past the wall. It confused people. So you have those limitations you're working with almost the same way you would if this was a real building you were capturing on camera. But I think I showed enough of that interior space to set the tone and establish the location for all the awesome fighting and stuff that is to come. So that's it for this week. I thought I would talk a lot more about the decisions I was making on the page this week and not so much mindset stuff, because I've been kind of busy this week and I don't have that much on my mind. But we'll always see what happens next week. Maybe I'll get down in the weeds next time. So I will be continuing my practice over here, and you do the same. And we'll catch you on the other side.